This is just a portfolio. What happened was that I came to the conclusion nobody really wants to. I've had a lifelong fascination with religion, worship, and houses of worship in particular in Harlem and throughout my travels in the U.S. and the Caribbean. I'm drawn to houses of worship in large measure because I enjoy being a part of the fellowships while I'm there, photographing and experiencing the different styles and forms of worship that I've experienced here and abroad. But more importantly, houses of worship are kind of a window into the cultures of the people who fellowship in those locations. And it's a unique kind of experience that I've had the privilege of being allowed to witness and share over the years. And now it's become my personal photography passion. The collection has grown to upwards of 500,000 images. And they show not only regular worship, but they show a panorama of life as it relates to communities of faith. The sacraments, the external activities, as well as what happens within the services. So I've been fortunate enough to capture christenings, baptisms, weddings, funerals, as well as those things that take place outside of the normal Sabbath day activities. And I've been very privileged to be allowed into these intimate spaces where people are struggling with the big issues in life, the big tragedies in life, the losses, as well as the joys. And so the houses of worship and our religious traditions are the places where we go during those important moments in life. In fact, many of us can look to our experiences in our churches, mosques, and synagogues, where the important remembrances are all connected to our houses and spaces of worship. Access is everything. And I always start with introducing myself as someone who is a part of the community of faith, someone who understands the sacred nature of what goes on. I share with them my first book on the Abyssinian Baptist Church. And so they look at me as a fellow worshiper, even when it may be a Christian church or a non-Christian house of worship. They accept me as someone who understands and respects what's happening. And so I'm given access in most instances that is completely unique in terms of what would be allowed the typical person who might attend a service or walked up with a camera wanting to take pictures. So it's more of a special privilege opportunity. Now, I also make sure that I give each house of worship a set of photographs from my visits so that they have a keepsake of my photography. I think that children photographs tend to stick with me. There's one photograph, I guess it's probably 15 years old. There was a joint prayer service, I think, at Riverbank, and it was on a major Islamic holiday, Eid al-Fitr. And I was there, allowed to photograph. And you know, kids don't sit still well in worship, I don't care. And there was a father, a very dignified man, who was a banker. And his son was walking around and moving around at the wrong times. And then finally, he sat next to his father and leaned his head over on his father's shoulder. That photograph became this kind of iconic, in part because it was a father and son. You know, we all kind of look for that image in our worship experience. That's one that I like an awful lot. Those photographs that reflect the musical experience. There are a number in the collection where I believe you can feel the power of the musical expression, the emotion, and the spirituality of what is happening through the music. And you can see several of those. There's one in particular where it's a gospel singer. We were about to shoot an event, and I said, let's take some pictures outside. And she started singing on the rocks on the Hudson River. And it turned out to be a real fascinating moment. I approach all of my worship work through the lens of a photographer. So I'm looking at how to capture the worship experiences, the rituals and the practices that happen within the service, but also how the churches and houses of worship are engaged in the communities outside of normal worship. But one house of worship in particular has a particularly visual event each year, the United House of Prayer for All People. They do an annual fire hose baptism, which takes place here in Harlem, but also it takes place in all of the 40 cities where the United House of Prayer has churches. And it goes back to the 1940s. And it's a practice that was started by the originator of the church, who was known as Sweet Daddy Grace. And Daddy Grace had a flair for the dramatic. He was Cape Verdean by birth, and he came to the States and formed his first church in Massachusetts. But over the years began to develop a form of worship that was unique to their congregation. So each year, in the first Saturday in August here in Harlem, this congregation produces their annual fire hose baptism. A pumper truck comes up, and hundreds of people come dressed in white, and they're showered from the fire hose. By the way, the United House of Prayer also has probably the best church food of any denomination in America. This community is as diverse as any you'd find any place in the country. I could almost do a book on world religion north of 96th Street in New York City. Virtually every faith practiced in the world is practiced somewhere in the Harlem or northern Manhattan communities, both Christian and non-Christian. So you can find varieties that don't exist elsewhere in the U.S. In fact, in addition to the major denominations, as they call them, the mainline churches, there are many faiths that immigrants from the African diaspora brought with them to New York. So there are traditional worship practices that happen in Harlem, mainline worship practices that happen, and then there's that middle ground where the immigrant experience gets merged with the American experience and something new surfaces and develops over time. So it's an extraordinarily rich, diverse mix of worship opportunities here. Houses of worship, even within the same denominations, Christian and non-Christian, can be quite different, so that people wonder, why are there so many Baptist churches? Why are there so many Catholic churches? Well, depending on the ethnicity and the age of the population and the language that they speak, the services can be very different within any particular denomination or in any particular house of worship. And each one is completely unique. I sort of strip myself of all of my expectations simply because it says United Methodist on the door does not tell me much about what goes on. And by the way, there's a United Methodist example. The Ghanaians in New York City represent a growing component within the Methodist Church. But Ghanaians worship in a particularly vibrant way, completely unlike what you would find in a typical United Methodist church. In fact, the music is very dynamic, and they dance in many of the congregations. Literally, they dance, because they come from a country and a mode of worship in Ghana where dance is a part of the sacred experience. And so I walked into a Methodist church ostensibly to attend a funeral. And it was an interesting kind of experience, because the funeral was for a church member whose father had died in Accra, Ghana. The church member could not get to the funeral. So the membership held a funeral without the body, if you will, on behalf of this particular parishioner. But at the service, they wore their ceremonial garb, there was lots of food, and there was dancing. And I was really, at first, quite surprised at that. But it also added a dimension to the service that I just found visually very compelling. I've been engaged in photographing religion pretty much for the past 40 years. And so I'm still at the point of just discovery. I can't even say I've begun to really scratch the surface. The collection started out to be a focus on a handful of denominations and houses of worship, a book that was going to be about 120, 150 photographs. The collection now is somewhere on the other side of 500,000 images. So I've seen a breadth and depth of worship visually that I had no way of anticipating. And now it includes photography from the Caribbean. So I'm still at the learning stage. One thing that I have noticed, though, here in Harlem, is that the small churches that in other cities people call storefronts, but in Harlem they're really churches housed in brownstones. They are a vanishing category because as the neighborhood is changing and real estate is sold to new folks who develop, those churches are being converted to private homes. And so that's a major change that's happening. It may be unnoticeable to many of us, but as I walk the neighborhoods, that category of small houses of worship is vanishing.